But I didn't know, I took the books from background, not the books goes on here. I went into the production contract. I didn't want to, I didn't go over the very details that the book went over.
Right, but I'm just saying that like,
okay, so we'll back up. I don't think there's anything that I discussed in detail the exam that you thought was in either place. We'll talk about it. Let me run through the exams and see how the results are. What's that? Oh, we talked about that in great length. I mean, I can understand how.
Can't get away with it.
I mean, it's in. I saw it in the index. All right, let's go. So, show of hands, was it worse or better? Horrible? Miserable? It was good. She said I didn't.
We'll see how good the test is when we get our grades back.
Okay. Oh, I'll have the grade. The question is how I'm going to get the grades back to you. Ryan asked me the same question earlier. I'm not quite sure how to do that other than to bring them back next week. But I think there's a posting method for grades.
Yes.
Canvas has it.
There we go, this amorphous canvas thing again. No, I did see something in one of my links for grades, but I thought that was semester grades.
No, that's for any grade.
I can do, okay, so if I can use that, I will post those that way.
Wait, so Dr. Forty didn't go over any of this? The canvas?
No.
He said, here you go. Learn how to drive.
Canvas. What's his name? The other one does. Wordster does better with Canvas.
Yes, Wordster knows the most about
Yeah.
Canvas.
I mean, I can actually get something posted. Canvas is just one app in the things that I get when I log on. So,
I would speak with Professor Wordster.
Yeah, they just started Canvas last semester. So
And Wordster is the most experienced with it because he always posts and does the online class.
okay. So again, keep in mind that I'm doing this
First time.
at part-time. They get to do this all week long and they don't have other things to do. I'm trying to make
You're
this.
trying to make that money.
Complain to them. All right. So everybody survived?
I think so.
We're here.
Probably be back next year.
No.
Just it.
We're good.
Okay, listen, if it turns out, like I said before, if any of the questions turn out that most of you missed it, I'll probably invalidate it. Okay? Because that means something's wrong with the question. But I have been more or less, I don't want to say trained, but I do have to learn how to do questions. Just in my inbox right now, I'm evaluating questions for the real estate certification exam. I'm not on the committee to write them anymore, but I volunteered because I just have nothing else to do with my life. To look at the questions that somebody else has written, and then they have me actually take that portion of the exam as if I were sitting for the exam to see are the questions wacko. Is there anything wrong with them? Are they invalid? And so they teach you all kinds of things about how not to put red herrings in and make the questions deliberately confusing. There was also these things about don't put in funny things, don't put in weird names. That's, gotta have a little bit of humor. All right. Glad you all survived it. Glad it wasn't too bad. Let's see if we can learn a little bit more and try and go down a couple of roads. At the risk of moaning and groaning, I have a few other financing type topics to talk about. Things I promised to, but today we're not going to go looking at loan documents or anything like that because that was the only time I actually physically saw people asleep. And I do understand it. They are perhaps the most boring things I have to look at and read. They are really bad, and they're long and they're boring. But so we're not going to do that anymore. And I didn't bring any props because I do have a couple of things that I'm actually going to read because I don't usually do that when I'm speaking. But I didn't bring props because the only good prop that I had was on the bond financing I'm going to talk about. It's a closing binder from a housing bond deal, and I just couldn't carry them. They are, I doubt anybody's ever seen what these financing closing binders are, and they may not even do them the same way anymore, but they are two leather-bound or leatherette-bound books about this thick each that have all of the documents from the closings. And they're very complicated. But I'm going to talk about why they're so complicated and why there's so many documents. But first, I want to talk about a concept called agreements for deed, also known as contracts for deed. It's something you don't see a lot anymore. People who don't understand the last thing I'll tell you about still try and use it because they think it's a great way to protect themselves. With an agreement for deed, you enter into what looks like a contract. And it's a contract for purchase and sale that provides that once the buyer has made so many of the payments under the contract, then the seller will convey title. In the meantime, the buyer is allowed to occupy the property and is allowed to enjoy all the ownership benefits of the property, which means they live there, but they have to take care of it. But they haven't paid for it all. And eventually down the road, when they pay enough towards it, they will then have a formal transaction where they'll pay the balance or they'll finance the balance and they'll get a deed from the seller. There are a lot of problems to it. The worst problem is what happened in the history of the land boom of old Florida back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, when hucksters, shysters, whatever you want to call them, were trying to sell unsuspecting northerners lots and property in Florida by using this method. They'd say, okay, if you pay me, $10 down and $1 a week for the next 15 years, you'll own this piece of land in sunny Florida. And so people would sign this contract, and they'd pay, and they'd pay. 5 years would go by, they'd been paying every week, and they'd miss a payment. Because whatever, they missed a payment. And they'd get a letter from the seller, the shyster selling the land, and said, sorry, you missed a payment under clause number 46, contract is over, goodbye. And so what happened was they'd been paying in for 5 years towards this piece of land, and because they missed one payment, they lost it. The contract was voided.
Oh, no.
Well, it sounds a little harsh, right? The Florida legislature looked at this and said, this is wrong. This is really not so much of a contract as it is a financing instrument. And so they passed a statute saying that this agreement for deed was the equivalent of a mortgage. And if the buyer stopped making payments, then the seller had to foreclose it, as in foreclosing a mortgage. Ryan, do we need to turn the camera on?
I have.
Oh, thanks. They have to, so it is deemed to be a mortgage and has to be foreclosed in the same manner as a mortgage. You sure?
Yes,
Okay.
double check.
And I'm going to talk to you a little bit later about the foreclosure process and what it means and how it works. What happens with an agreement for deed is an interesting separation in levels of title. There is legal title and there is equitable title. Legal title stays with the seller. That means the deed is still in the name of the seller. But all the benefits and obligations of ownership, equitable title, get transferred to the buyer with the agreement for deed. And so it's split, and you cannot take the equitable title back without the foreclosure process because it's unfair, actually inequitable would be a better word. So there's a split between the two types of title. That comes into play and causes all kinds of problems when judgment liens occur, because a judgment against the legal title holder can become a lien upon the property. But we'll talk about judgments and liens later on. I don't want to get into that right now. So that's what an agreement for deed is all about. You do occasionally see that now when somebody's trying to sell a piece of property. It's usually a house that they bought for flipping, the market's a little sour, and they have somebody that comes along and the buyer doesn't have a lot of cash. But the seller's desperate. They've been trying to sell this property and they just can't get rid of it. So they enter into an agreement and they say, okay, let's say it's a $250,000 house. And I'm making a deal with these people that if they're gonna give me $10,000 and move in, and they're gonna pay me every month for the next 5 years, and when they've paid it down to whatever the number is gonna be, then they can go get a regular mortgage because they'll have enough equity to do that, and I'll give them the deed. And so every once in a while, you do see these agreements for deed pop back up. Not used very often. It was used, like I said, it's mostly historical, but it is basically a financing tool and is treated for all purposes, for enforcement purposes like a mortgage. Now we're going to go from the low end of the spectrum to the completely other side of the financing world, and I'm going to talk about bond financing. Bond, B-O-N-D, bond. What is a bond, you might ask? You've heard of stocks and bonds, financing classes? Okay? Stocks are equity, bond is a debt obligation. So, a debt obligation issued on Wall Street, which is usually issued by a municipality or governmental entity. That's a public bond or municipal bond. Bonds that are issued by private corporations, that's strictly a borrowing obligation. What I'm talking about in this kind of financing, there are different kinds. Let me talk first about municipal financing, municipal bonds. These are bonds that are issued by a governmental entity. Could be the state of Florida, for example, could be Broward County, could be the city of Fort Lauderdale. They all have authority under various statutes to issue bonds, which is basically a simple way to say that these municipalities are going to borrow money. Why would they borrow money? Well, they borrow money for different purposes. Why would a government borrow money? Well, one is to provide housing, public housing. One is to provide roads. Got to pay for the roads somehow. And maybe water and sewer plants have to be constructed. So what they do is they go out into the public sector and they sell these bonds. The bonds are often unsecured. In the case of a municipality, that's called a general obligation bond. That means that the security is simply the general obligation of the credit of the city, state, or county issuing the bond. Sometimes those bonds have a specific pledge. For example, Turnpike Authority. Turnpike Authority issues a bond and says that it's going to be repaid out of the tolls collected on the turnpike. So there's a specific source of repayment. And there's various things they can do like that, various revenue sources that can be used. Sometimes it's a publicly constructed entertainment venue. It could be a stadium, for example. Yes?
So those would be the two types, general obligation and revenue bonds?
Revenue bonds is coming from the revenue specific. There may be other kinds, but those are two specific different types, yes. Could be used for an entertainment venue, could be a bridge, all kinds of public uses. Other kinds of bonds that are in between public and private are housing bonds. Now, I said a housing bond is one of the uses of this kind of bond financing, but the government sometimes, but not always, builds housing. There is a method where the government will provide bond financing to private developers to construct low-income housing. There are a couple of different things that go along with it. First of all, there's the bond financing, which is usually much less expensive in terms of the interest rate than typical bank financing. And secondly, the developer can obtain federal income tax credits for providing the low-income housing. Those gigantic binders I described earlier on that I have on my shelf are from low-income housing deals. And what happens is, the way the financing is set up, it can be a combination of the bond financing and the tax incentives, and the tax incentives can be so great that the developer can do the deal without putting up any money whatsoever. It does a public good. The occupancy of the housing is restricted because in order to qualify for the bonds and to qualify for the tax credits, they have to have the housing available only for residents who are earning 50% or less of the median income. Don't worry about that statistic, it just happens to be the rule.
What agency?
It varies.
Okay.
Florida has the Florida Housing Finance Authority. It could be all kinds, could be HUD, yes?
How much does that financing authority body, how much do they allocate for low-income housing for the state of Florida?
Oof, I don't know that statistic. It's, you know, part of that money actually comes from the lottery and things and places like that. It comes from the sales tax revenue, dock stamp revenue. I don't know the allocation. It's a statistic you could look up. I have no way of knowing that.
So how do they vet for developers that they give these funds to?
It's a very competitive process. So it's a good question. So developers love, you know, if they can get into it, first of all, they have to show that they have experience doing this kind of work. And there's a point system, there's a competitive point system, and they have to show things like, for example, you can build where all the residents have to be qualified under the standard of 50% or less of the median. That's a 100% credit deal. You can mix it. You can say that we're not going to rent more than 20% of the units to people that aren't qualified that way. Then there's location. Is it going to be in an area where they really need the housing, or is it going to be sitting on the outskirts of a country club? We actually had a client that did one on an out parcel of a country club, but it qualified because of all the other factors that were involved, and the state at the time was very hungry for the deals. So there's a whole list of things that they look at, and hopefully, although I'm saying this hopefully, there is no political element to this, but as a practical matter, there probably is. Because if somebody knows somebody that's on the authority, and they've got experience, and they may be preferred developers, the developers are competing for it so strongly because, number one, if it's done right, they really don't, not only do they not need any cash, but the credits that are coming back to help finance this kind of housing are so substantial that there's going to be enough money to pay their developer fee up front, even before the project is successful. And then, once it's done, just the project is acquired and held as rental housing, and it's just,
it's a win-win situation.
It's a win-win situation, and of course it provides housing. So, you know, remember that people forget the fact that part of our tax code's purpose is to promote public policy. It's revenue on one side, but promoting public policy on the other. So by incentivizing that, you're trying to get developers to help and provide something that we need. Good question. Okay, so those are public type of municipal bond financing. The other kind of bond financing that we see is securitized financing. This is a financing tool for private investment done on fairly large transactions. For example, you finish building a hotel or an office building or an apartment complex, and you want to go and get permanent financing on there. You put down, you go and you arrange this promissory note, that comes first, we talked about that already, then a mortgage, and then the whole package is actually sold as part of a bond fund. So this bond fund is put together, and the bonds are sold to the public. They could be sold to corporations, they could be sold to individual investors, and there's people that want to invest their money because a bond is just like putting your money in a savings account. You put in your money, you get paid interest on a quarterly basis, and then eventually you get paid your money back. That's a minor simplification. So it's a Wall Street product, this securitized financing. It's very difficult from the borrower's end because there are a tremendous number of rules, because it has to be standardized. Typically, if you're going to the bank and getting a note and a mortgage, and you're going to do financing somewhere, you're sitting across the table from your banker, you're working out the terms with your banker, the banker then assigns it to a local lawyer, and the paperwork is subject to some back and forth negotiation as to the terms and conditions of the loan documents, which I promise you'll never see again. And you work it all out. There's different things that are to the advantage or disadvantage. With securitized financing, there's none of that. These documents are like set in stone. And they even say when you get the documents, because everybody doing borrower side work in real estate law, they're going to look at them. I'm not going to let my client sign a stack like this of documents without looking through them. But they let you know when they give it to you, you can't make changes, because it's got to be part of a standardized group of documents. Probably the most important differential between this kind of financing and what I would call conventional financing, go to your local banker, is that there is a prohibition You cannot prepay this. Let me run through this one more time. You are prohibited from prepaying bond financing. What a strange thing to hear. Why do you think that might be? Right, what'd you say?
Reinvestment risk.
That's probably a good answer, but let me elaborate on it.
Okay.
The people putting the money up, the people who are buying the bond on the other side, we call them widows and orphans funds, because you have people with money, the little old lady, husband's gone, and she doesn't know what to do with the investment market. She needs a safe place to put that money. Pardon me for the sexist example. She needs a place to put the money where she knows that check's coming in every quarter or every month, and it's not going to be at risk. Well, for the people that did that when that bond was paying 8% back 10 years ago, they invested in that knowing that for the next 20 years or 30 years, they were going to get that 8% return on their investment. And they made a contract with the issuer of the bond saying, for 30 years, I'm getting this money, this return on my investment. At the end of the 30 years, you're going to pay me back. And there's no right in that contract for the bond issuer to prepay it. So the bond issuer says, when they loan the money out to earn the money, same thing. You're agreeing that if you take this money from us, you're not going to pay it back for the next X number of years. Well, that sounds awfully restrictive on someone owning a piece of property. So we have to have some kind of a mechanism. Maybe you have to sell the property. Maybe the property is destroyed. Maybe a hurricane blows it down. You have to have some mechanism to make this mortgage go away from your property without offending the provider of the money. When I say offending, I mean violating the legal covenants in the bond documents. And that mechanism is called defeasance. This is a fairly complicated concept, but what happens is you transfer the debt. Remember, we have this note floating around, and you want to take it off the mortgage, but you have to be willing to provide equal or better security to the bondholders to know that they're going to get paid what they signed on for, what they agreed to receive. So with defeasance, you take it's a fairly complicated closing transaction that shifts the debt to government securities. That's usually what they do, is you have to be able to buy treasury securities in an amount sufficient to make the debt service payment under the bond agreement. Now, the complication with that is, imagine, in my example, that when the bondholder issued the bond at an 8% interest rate, and now you're looking and it's a 3% interest rate, we have a problem. We have a problem because if you have a $50 million bond issue, and let's say that let's just say it's a $50,000 mortgage on a downtown office building, secured by one of these financing transactions, and the owner of the office building wants to sell it because rents have changed, the market has changed, they need to get rid of this building, and the only way they can sell the building is to get rid of this mortgage, and the only way they can get rid of the mortgage is to defease it. They have to buy a lot more U.S. government securities in dollar amount than the face amount of the debt that they're trying to get rid of in order to make today's 3% treasury securities yield as much money to the bondholder as that 8% mortgage did. So it's a huge, I gave you a very lopsided example where we went from an 8% to a 3%. That's a very, very expensive transaction, and they probably go out of their way not to do it. And the way to avoid that in a lot of situations is, unlike most mortgage financing, sometimes with the right qualifications, these loans can be assumed. When I say assumed, I mean the property can be transferred subject to these mortgages. There really is usually no personal obligation under these types of debts. It just doesn't work that way. Except for, did I go over the bad boy guarantees when we went over the guarantees? No? Okay. Well, you're so kind, thank you. So, a personal guarantee on a loan says, I'm standing behind the entity that signed. Whatever they have to do, I have to do. Which means, if they don't pay the money, I'll pay the money. That's obviously the most important example. A bad boy guarantee goes along with what's called non-recourse financing. Non-recourse financing means that if the debt is not paid, if the promissory note is not repaid, the holder, the bank, the bondholder, somebody, agrees that they're only going to look to the property, not to the person. With the exception of a situation where the borrower, or the principals of the borrower, are bad. Meaning, they stole money, they stole security deposits, they stole rent money, they stole insurance proceeds, they lied, they misrepresented the financial condition of the project or of the borrower. Something bad. It's a list of things. But not just, hey, I can't pay. Hey, I can't pay, they take the property back. Okay. So, securitized financing, it's all standardized documents, very inflexible. It's usually large amounts of money, not little amounts of money. And sometimes, though, if you can qualify for all of this, the interest rates are going to be lower, and they're going to stay stable and or fixed for a long period of time. And of course, to those of us that are closing the transactions, the fees are enormous. The only problem is you have to deal with New York lawyers. Thank you. Whatever you've heard, it's all true. They are a different animal. I go to a national seminar on leasing every spring, and it's a group from all over the United States and Canada. And what we do is we break into small groups and discuss the issues. And then at the end of each session, each table has somebody that gets up and presents our table's position of an issue, and then it gets discussed around the room. And then from session to session, you change tables, so you're working in small groups with different people all through. The positions that the New York lawyers take are just so hard-ass and unreasonable that it's almost funny. And it's all of them. It's not like it's one or two of them. It's a culture. So dealing with them is an experience. It's a living. Okay. So I talked about bond financing, I talked about securitized financing, municipal financing. The next kind of semi-public, or is really public financing, that's in a similar vein, is called an improvement district. This is actually a created quasi-governmental entity that's created through a legislative. I guess it has to go through the legislature to be created, and it is a governmental layer. It's not a city, it's not a town, but it's put over an area for the purposes of raising the money to build the infrastructure, roads, sewers, lakes, drainage, whatever you need. It can issue obligations that are sold in the financial market, and the obligation to make the payments are assessed against all the property owners inside of the district.
What's it called?
It's called an improvement district. Pardon me? The improvement district actually assesses the property owners just right on their real estate tax bill. There'll be, so if you look at a tax bill in one of these areas, a real estate, and I will bring in tax bills later on when we start talking about, a little bit more about the local taxation, but there's what's called ad valorem tax, which is a tax that is imposed based upon the value of the property, and then there's non-ad valorem taxation. It could be a fire department assessment to improve the fire department. It could be one of these improvement districts. It could be, there's all kinds of things that come under the non-ad valorem, just some other obligation that gets imposed, usually by the city or the county, to pay for something. And they decide that in order to pay for this, instead of going out and borrowing the money, they're going to tax everybody and collect the money. It's almost the same thing from the homeowner, from the property owner's standpoint. So, but it creates a layer of taxation in addition to county and city. It's almost like running a city. So I can give you two very good examples of this, one pretty close to home. Once upon a time, there was the Indian Trace Improvement District. Anybody ever hear of that? You say yes? I figured.
I've spent a lot of time in that district.
Okay. The Indian Trace Improvement District was created for the purpose of taking an area and creating a whole new community. And it created all the roads, all the lighting on the roads, all the landscaping, all of this water and sewer that served, and then neighborhoods were created inside of this district. And people that bought homes or commercial property all had to pay as if they were paying a tax to a city. And eventually, and I'm not sure what the impetus was for the transformation, but eventually the people in the area, and I guess part of the district, decided that rather than continue to operate it as an improvement district, they were going to create a city, which happens from time to time. So they incorporated the city of Weston. Weston, you've all heard, have you heard this little place out there? So that is what happened, because in the early days, people in Weston were paying, for various bills, and they were also paying this thing on their tax bill. No one quite knew what it was, but that's what it was. There's another one you may have encountered over time called the REE Creek Improvement District. The REE Creek Improvement District is not in this general geographic area, but when I tell you what it is, you're going to all go, oh. So the REE Creek Improvement District was created in the 1960s when a particular organization started acquiring pieces of land little by little, called an assemblage. And an assemblage means that they literally sent down a guy with a briefcase who went to a rancher over here and a farmer over there and a property owner over here, never said who they were buying it for, and they started buying pieces of land. Little by little, they got all put together. You're nodding like you might know what I'm talking about, so don't give it away yet. And this was done secretly, and the REE Creek Improvement District was formed not only for the purpose of providing the infrastructure and the roads and the drainage and the electric, but they went further. The people that were behind this reached an agreement with the state that in exchange for certain rights back and forth, they would have 100% control of everything that went on inside this special improvement district, and they wouldn't have to contribute to outside things like most developers and landowners would if they were building a project. Now, that sounded like a great idea because the area that was being developed by this organization was in the middle of nowhere, and no one thought, okay, well, whatever, let's give them the control, let them have all this, and we don't have to bother with the infrastructure there. Well, anybody want to take a guess besides someone who knows?
Is it Disney?
Yes.
Oh,
Very good.
Disney.
Disney. It's Disney World. So everything, if you go down, I don't even know what road it is anymore, you will see the fire station, right just past Hotel Row, down like just off of where I-4 is, and you'll see the REE Creek Improvement District Fire Department. And what they did there was they made an arrangement where they control all the development inside the boundaries. They don't have to go to anybody for building permits except their internal people. They don't have to contribute impact fees, and this was a real problem. They don't have to contribute impact fees. I don't think I've discussed impact fees, so let me tell you what they are. When you go to build a project, whether it's a housing project, an office park, just anything where you're taking raw land and you're creating it and you're transforming it into something where there's going to be people, the government, as part of the approval process, says you're bringing more people into the area, and therefore, as part of what it's going to cost you to have authority to do that, you have to pay for the impact you're going to have on the community. That means something to pay for the roads. Because if you're going to bring in 5,000 people into this area, it's going to be an extra burden on our road system. Imagine bringing in, I don't know how many millions of people go to Disney World in a year, and what it does to the roads there. And if you've ever spent any time in Orlando, even visiting, you'll know that every time you go up there, there's highway construction, and they're expanding the highways going in and out, and they're putting new highways in, and almost all of that was caused by Disney World. But they didn't have to contribute to any of it.
How did they get away with it?
They got away with it because they made this deal with the legislature, because what happened was once they acquired the land, the Disney organization came to Florida and met with the state officials and said, we have been looking for a place for an East Coast Disneyland. And if you do this for us, then we will bring our Disney to you. Well, you can see in today's world, I mean, Orlando was a nothing. Orlando was a little town like any of the other little cities in north central Florida. I mean, Gainesville has the university. There's all kinds of cities, little cities around there. Orlando was just another one of those. Now, it's a tourist mecca. And there is so much revenue to the state, not to mention to the surrounding areas, so they made a deal.
Okay.
And that's what happened back then. You know, there's all kinds of books written about it.
Going back, do you think they should have kept the deal, or?
Well, I think if they didn't make the deal, from the things that I've read about it, if they hadn't made that deal with Disney, Disney wouldn't have come to Florida. I don't know where else they might have gone, because Walt liked the weather, he liked the fact that they didn't have snow here, so it could operate all year round.
All year round.
Like the people.
That would have been.
The second state would be Atlanta, Georgia.
I don't know.
But
I don't know. Atlanta wasn't that big, it wasn't huge then anyway. Hold on a second. So there are actually books out there that are written. I believe it's called How the World Began. If you're really curious about it, and it talks about this process. But there literally was a man with a briefcase, and eventually, after 3/4 of the land was acquired, it got out as to who it was. And of course, as soon as it got out, the remaining parcels became much more expensive.
The final Jeopardy question was, the name was, the alias was MT Lots, was what Walt Disney was buying the property under the alias. Is this funny guy, MT Lots?
You know who M.T. Graves was? No. Okay. There's nobody in here that would remember him. He was M.T. Graves was a stage name of a local, I think he was a weatherman in Miami, who on Saturday afternoon hosted the horror movie show. And he would come on in some ridiculous costume. If you Google him, you'll see it. And it was just, it goes back to old Miami. Yes?
Since it's non-ad valorem, if, say, they go unpaid, is it the same process?
Yes. It's still subject to be sold as a tax certificate. The only difference between ad valorem and non-ad valorem is with ad valorem, it's equally split amongst, with non-ad valorem, it's equally split amongst the properties. Ad valorem is by value. Other than that, it's all the same.
So it still supersedes, like...
It's on top, it's the level of taxes.
Now, you mentioned something in describing that improvement, the improvement district, that is, how else could a community, because there's a community by me that they have their own, they do their own code. They have their own code enforcement, Sea Ranch on A1A. They have their...
That's a town.
Oh, that's a town?
Sea Ranch Lakes is a town. Yes, they're an incorporated town.
I mean, it's so small,
It
so
doesn't
I
matter.
always looked at it as a community, but I could never understand how the heck do they do
Yeah.
all that
Now,
stuff.
Understand that even if it wasn't a town, if you had private restrictions, so, communities have declarations of covenants.
So I could have put it, they could have put it in
They
their
could,
private.
so most communities, let's talk about residential communities for a minute, have declarations of covenants. And they say that a house can't be smaller than 2,000 square feet, you have to have a side-facing garage, you can't have an accessory building, all kinds of rules and regulations that you might find in a building code, but it's even more restrictive than the building code. Because it's agreed by contract between the developer that creates the association and anybody that buys a lot. And that's why you see it in the deed, anyone buying a lot buys it and agrees to the restrictions that are recorded.
Well,
Those are private covenants.
I understand the private covenants aspect. See, they're located in Lauderdale by the Sea. And I always thought Lauderdale by the Sea would be the city in that area, but they're not the city.
I believe, and I'm not 100% sure, but I think Sea Ranch Lakes has its own, is its own
Yeah, it is.
incorporated-
It's its own incorporated
Yeah.
city
So
by
it's right.
itself.
It's a separate
And
town.
I can understand that. That's why I'm asking that this improvement development thing that you just talked about, that have any relation to how they are a city, or is it
No, you
just
could, no,
how
because
they were developed?
incorporating a
is
city
the
has to be
setback?
done at the state level.
Okay.
It's a carve out, and actually, what's happened is there used to be large areas of each county, and there still are small areas where it wasn't a city, and little by little, cities would annex, grab hold of and bring into their city, and the cities would expand and add things. The counties and the state has encouraged over the years this annexation because the county doesn't want to provide the services anymore. Now, what's actually happened in Broward County in particular is that the county services provider, the county, like the sheriff and the fire department, have offered to take over the fire and police functions in some of these smaller communities, which means that the smaller communities don't need to maintain their own forces. They lose the independence, but it's an economic thing. So BSO has managed to, that's the Broward Sheriff's Office, has managed to expand and expand and expand and take on more responsibility and take over. Now, I don't know what Sea Ranch Lakes has. You know, Davie certainly has their own police. Hollywood has their own police, but some of the other communities don't. Yes?
So our improvement districts, you know, like a municipality has commissioners that are elected, but with an improvement district, is it appointed at the legislative level?
No, I believe they are elected.
Okay.
I believe they're like the drainage districts and things like that. You may have seen in the newspaper recently that the governor has asked for the resignation of the commissioners of the South Florida Water Management District. That is a district, an improvement district, but they're more of a regulatory agency, but they're charged with maintaining the drainage system in South Florida, Southeast Florida.
Okay.
And drainage being very, very important. You also have they have the authority to do things like issue permits and regulate, and they also control things like when they open the floodgates, and that's always been a controversy. We hear that there's a storm coming our way, a hurricane. They sometimes have to lower the water levels to take on additional rain, but if you do it prematurely, you lower the water levels, and then we have a drought situation. So that's called water management.
But if there's only one landholder, then it's an easy vote, right?
Yes, but that's, oh, yeah, absolutely. But that's very unusual.
Yeah.
And like I said, that was a special deal. Okay. That was bond financing. Another thing that comes up from time to time is seller financing. I'm sure those of you that work in real estate have heard about seller financing, and sometimes it comes up because it's difficult to sell a piece of property. Usually these things happen when a seller is having trouble disposing of property and then they become the bank. The phrase purchase money financing does not always mean seller financing. Purchase money financing means mortgage taken out to acquire a piece of property. And that has special lien priority if there is a judgment hovering against the buyer. And the buyer buys for cash, assuming it's not homestead, and that's a little beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here. Assuming the buyer buys for cash, as soon as the buyer takes title, that judgment lien is going to attach to the property. However, if there's purchase money financing, which means the proceeds of that mortgage was used to acquire title of the property, that mortgage will attach before the hovering judgment will attach. So it's special lien priority. Typically though, in layman's parlance, if you're not talking about that technicality, when you hear somebody say, oh, I'm going to get a purchase money mortgage, they usually mean that the seller is going to provide financing. So, is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Well, let me share with you some thoughts about what I call the peril of purchase money paper. And what happened would be that when interest rates are climbing, or somebody's credit is mediocre, it's not so easy for someone to come up with the 20% down, or even the 25% down that a bank might require. So that's a situation where the seller might say, okay, I'm willing to provide the difference between what you can get from the bank and the 3% down that you have. Now, take out of this equation the concept of government-backed financing like FHA and VA that lets people get in with a 3% down payment. I'm talking about a situation where it's just a relatively desperate seller and they're financing with a second mortgage, assuming for the moment that it's permitted by the first mortgage, the difference between the 20%, the 80% mortgage that they get from the bank and what needs to be provided to the closing table to get to the purchase price. It seems like the seller has an easy task doing this. All they have to do is hold a piece of paper. If the interest rate is reasonable, and often the interest rate will be a little bit higher than what you'll see from the bank because there's a little more risk holding a second mortgage. But for the seller might say, well, you know, if I take the cash and I go and put it in the bank, I'm only going to get 2 or 3%. This guy's willing to pay me 7% to hold this paper. This is a good idea. Well, what the seller, and unfortunately the people that are advising them, overlook are the perils that are involved in holding the purchase money. Believe it or not, sometimes the buyers don't pay. Can you believe that? Someone's going to actually buy a house, they're going to put all this money down, they're going to live in it for 6 months, and then they're going to stop paying. And we know what happens if that happens, right? It's bad. Another time that this becomes even worse, and more prevalent, is where the seller says, all right, I'll hold the mortgage, but I'm only going to hold it for 3 years. So you make your payments to me as if it were a 20-year mortgage, but at the end of 3 years, you have to pay me the balance. This is called a balloon mortgage. It's called a balloon mortgage because it goes pop at the end of the, no, it's a term, but think about it. There's a big payment at the end. So if you look at a payment schedule, it looks like this, like this, like this, like this. So I guess it looks like a balloon if you were to draw out a graph. I don't really know what how the word was assigned to it, but that is what it's called. And it's even in the statutes where you're required, when you write a balloon mortgage, to have a balloon mortgage legend on the mortgage. In the top of the mortgage and over the signature block, it's a warning that is required that says, this is a balloon mortgage. The final payment is more than X times the regular monthly payment. The final payment will be X. So what happens is you go to borrow money and you agree to this routine, and maybe the second mortgage is $50,000 and you're making an extra $500 a month payment, but at the end of 3 years, you have a $40,000 balloon. That's a surprise. So they made it so it's not a surprise, they put it in big bold letters and that it's required that way. Well, what happens if the balloon comes and they don't have the money? The seller has one choice. Anybody? There's the answer, foreclose. So if the seller starts a foreclosure action, when I wrote this original outline, which is a long time ago, I said the seller can expect to spend 4 to 8 months tied up in legal proceedings. That was back in the days when a mortgage foreclosure was normal. Maybe it's back to a little more normal now than it was, but the last several years when things were bad, the courts were so clogged up with mortgage foreclosures, you could be in there for 18 months before it would get done, just because of the delays and things. So let's just say that it could take a year. During this year, the buyer's living in the property, and they've stopped making payments. Worse, if it was a second mortgage, and the buyer has stopped making the payments to the first mortgage, then that could be in jeopardy as well. Because the seller has to either pay off the first mortgage, which means reaching back into his pocket, and which typically in the lower price range situations where these occur, the seller's not going to have that cash sitting in the bank to do this, or they're going to have to start making the payments on the first mortgage, which is a strain on the seller who thinks he's gotten rid of this house, in order to protect his second mortgage position. Because as you'll see when we talk about foreclosures themselves, that second mortgage is going to get wiped out. The seller could wind up taking back the property in foreclosure and find out that the buyer never paid the real estate tax bill. While most mortgages in residential have an escrow component for real estate taxes, not all of them do, and if they don't, or if they have defaulted and haven't been paying that mortgage as well, the taxes might be unpaid as well. So now you have a seller who sold and took back this wonderful purchase money mortgage, this junior mortgage, and now they're winding up paying the first mortgage on the house they think they got rid of. They're winding up having to pay the real estate taxes, and worse yet, when they do successfully throw the people out of the house could be completely destroyed. I've seen situations, physically gone and seen with clients, of what someone who's being evicted or foreclosed can do to a house, and it's indescribably horrible. If the holder of the first mortgage in our scenario moves quickly, then the holder of the second, our seller, faces the risk of being wiped out completely through the foreclosure action. If that happens, then they really have to deal with it financially. They have to do something. They either have to pay the mortgage off, which I said is difficult, or make the payments, even if the bank will allow that. Now, once a foreclosure starts, the bank accelerates the debt, part of the foreclosure process, and says, legally says, you haven't paid, you're in default, and you have to pay the whole amount off. That's called acceleration. Acceleration means to move forward to the point where the entire principal balance is due and payable. Now, as a practical matter, not as a legal matter, but as a practical matter, most banks will allow that mortgage to be reinstated, which means if you pay all the back payments and you pay all the fees and costs associated with the foreclosure, the bank will not only stop the foreclosure, but they will de-accelerate and go back to allowing the payments to be made normally.
Doesn't that have an acceleration clause, and would that only be allowed to have an acceleration clause?
See, every mortgage has an acceleration clause.
It's required.
Well, it's every mortgage has it. I wouldn't say it's required, but that it exists.
Okay.
That's their primary remedy in a default in a mortgage, in a promissory note, forget the mortgage, is if you don't make your payments, now the contract is over, you have to pay me as if we were at the end of the contract.
Right, okay.
And that's really why you think of it as acceleration, you're moving forward in time. Okay? Okay, it's not always a situation where it's a first mortgage is ahead of the seller. Sometimes if the seller has property that they own for cash, they're even more tempted to say, hey, what's my risk? If I sell the property, I'm having trouble selling it. If I hold the mortgage, I'm going to have a good investment and there's nobody ahead of me, and that's true. In that case, the only thing ahead of them is the real estate taxes. The problem is they have a much bigger amount of money at risk, and they still have to worry about not having, maybe they did it so they could live off the money, live off those payments. Well, those payments have now stopped, and then they've turned into an outflow. They've turned into an outflow because there's expenses of the foreclosure, the real estate taxes. Sometimes they have to worry about fixing the house back up. They have to regain possession, and it's a long time. You asked a question at one point earlier about a receiver. And I think when I was talking about mortgage financing, I mentioned that the purpose of a receiver is to take possession of the property, but that's primarily in commercial foreclosures. Because in commercial foreclosures, let's say we take this whole scenario and move it from a house to an office building. Now you have an office building with 20 tenants in there, and the borrower has stopped paying. Perhaps the borrower stopped paying because the rent, maybe it could just be a crook. I mean, that always happens. There's always a group of people who will do it deliberately, knowing they can put the rents in their pocket, and when they get chased, they get chased. More likely, it's some other default issue, but what the holder of the mortgage does not want, whether it's an institution or private, is they don't want the borrower / property owner to be taking the rent money, putting it in the pocket, and not paying the mortgage. So they go to court and they ask the court to appoint a receiver who is an independent third party who takes control of the property, collects the rents so that it doesn't get into the hands of the borrower, makes whatever debt service they can make, and maintains the property until the legal proceedings go through and the foreclosure is complete.
He basically becomes the association, right?
No, this is not an association situation. This is a property owner. this is not, we're talking about a mortgage, an owner, a building, there's no association. This is where you have someone who's the property manager, becomes the property manager.
Okay.
So how, can this be done safely? Well, the simple rule is act like a bank. That means that use the same kind of rules and evaluation as an institutional lender would use. Do a credit report. Make sure that the loan-to-value ratio doesn't exceed, I'm going to say 80%. Because then you know that that borrower has a substantial investment in the property and they're going to not be as fast to walk away from it. So if you have to be in a second mortgage position, then make sure that you make contact with the holder of the first mortgage and have the first mortgage agree that if there's a default in payment, that the second mortgage holder gets notice of default. These kinds of second mortgages or purchase money financing, it's not unique to real estate. You'll see it a lot in small business financing, because in small business financing, when you're selling the convenience store, for example, much more common that you don't have somebody that has cash that wants to come in and take over. So you have to hold paper. It's much riskier, the interest rates are much higher, but it seems to be a much more common practice. And of course, there's always one final risk in dealing with this or any other kind of enforcement rights, and that's bankruptcy. Because if the property owner files bankruptcy, everything grinds to a halt. The bankruptcy court will make them show that they have enough money to come forward and make the payments over time, and they'll give them a chance to come up with the arrearage, but the foreclosure comes to a halt. So what happens? Let me now talk a little bit twofold about what happens when the payments stop. And for the most part, I want to talk in a commercial setting because it's less common in residential, but there are things that go on, and they go on in any case. So this is a situation where you have the borrower and the lender. The borrower, for whatever reason, has stopped making its payments. And let's assume that they haven't vanished, but they're having tough times, their business is bad, the rents are down, something's going on. Well, the first thing that the lender is going to do is send a default notice. Basically, it's a letter that says, you're in default. Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise to the borrower, because they know they haven't been making their payments. If it comes as a surprise to the borrower, then something's really wrong. And it's not completely impossible, because there are situations where you could have a third-party management company in there. You could have somebody who lives far away that has a piece of property down here being operated by a third party who's stealing their money. And they don't know anything about it until they get the default notice. That's usually fixed right away. At this point, the lender has to make some choices. First choice, of course, is to accelerate the debt and foreclose. The second choice might be to sit down with the borrower and do what's called a workout. This happens a lot because the banks don't want to own the property if they can avoid it. There are opportunities, but maybe the borrower says, look, I'm having a problem, my rent roll isn't what it's supposed to be, I need a little more time, I need a little help here, work with me for 6 months, let me do this, 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 and this, and I'll get back on track, and let's take the arrearage for the money I haven't paid you, and we'll spread it out over the next 3 years, and I'll pay it back to you with interest. And that's a workout. Sometimes the loan gets modified. When we had our recession, the late 2008, 9, that time, there were situations where the banks were sitting with the borrower and saying, okay, you have this high interest rate and we see you're having a problem, we're going to modify the loan. We're going to sometimes forgive the arrearage, we're going to lower the interest rates, we're going to adjust your payments, we're going to make it easier for you to make these payments and do what you want to do. Sometimes the borrower gives up. The borrower gives up, and people have to give up, then they can do what's called a deed in lieu of foreclosure. this is where the borrower says, I don't want to fight you, I know I can't make my payments, I know there's a mortgage, I know I owe you the money, I'm going to give you the bank, I'm going to give you the property back. Now, if you remember, I said to you one of the elements that we talked about in the conveyancing was that the deed has to be delivered and accepted. So the bank has to agree to this. You cannot just mail the bank a deed. A chuckle perhaps, but people try it. Oh, absolutely. Someone knows that they don't want to be foreclosed, they don't want it on their record, so they literally mail the bank a deed and think they're done, but they're not. Sometimes the borrower will come to the bank and say, look, I owe you $4 million on this piece of property, my rent roll's bad, I can't pay. I have somebody that will buy the property, but they'll only give me $3.2 million. I can make the sale, I can pay you the $3.2 million, I won't take anything out of it. This is called a short sale. You hear about this all the time, and it's really a very simple concept, that the bank is going to accept a short payoff, and pay off less than what they're fully owed. Now, the evaluation that the bank's going to make is going to depend upon the borrower's situation. Has the borrower been good? What's the property worth? They're going to do an appraisal. The bank does an appraisal and sees that the property is worth no more than $3.2 million. They're going to say, hey, if we foreclose and spend the time and money to foreclose, we're going to take this property back, and we're going to have to try and resell it, and we're not going to get any more than that. And this is going to take us 6 to 8 months to accomplish this. We can take the money right now, but now you have an $800,000 number floating out there. The difference between the short sale and what the bank is owed. There's a couple of different ways the bank can do this. Now, if they're dealing with someone who is wealthy, and they know it, and they know the customer, and there's real guarantees, they're going to say, okay, we'll let you sell the property, but you're going to have to pay us that difference, or a portion of that difference, either now or over the next X number of years. So they can allow the short sale, but they're still going to enforce the debt obligation as against the person. That's how the short sale works. Another way, of course, is they can just write it off. If they know they're not going to get it, and they know the property is not worth the amount of the debt, they're going to write it off, take what they can get, and be done. They're losing the money, but they're going to lose the money either way. Okay, the alternative to the workout. The alternative to the workout is going to take place after I go reload the water bottle.
Okay.
So take a break for just a second. And if you need to take a break as well.
Same lake, but so South Carolina, the center is small thermal. The center when he died, they named the lake after it's like the Georgian.
So you are from?
I'm from Westminster, which is
The question is,
Augusta has a big Fort Gordon
I mean,
on the big army base. Oh no, I'm from Westminster. So. And it's the closest one,
See,
the
I put
closest
one of the
military
jokers.
base.
I said he's lucky.
It's
It
like
was reported to the federal
Clemson
whatever.
University's right there.
See, it was either, to me, it was either one of the other two.
Georgia line is.
It was,
You
I
have
never
to
heard
report
it,
it.
I never remember him saying
No,
that.
It was in the video.
I remember him talking about like that.
because I was like.
It's great. Yeah, so this is, and this is
But,
foothills,
if
the
it's anything more than, what was it?
the mountains there. This is
Yeah,
all
you'd follow this paper
How does he
now.
put it?
That's
How
Georgia.
should that really be right?
Because I thought he was trying to make it like, so if you had the cash to do
Here
it,
is,
you wouldn't have, like, the point is that you don't need finance. That's what I thought he was trying to say, so, okay, no one can do that, because no one has $60,000 cash just laying around. That's what I thought he was trying to
You
do.
Some people do.
No, I know people say, I know a lot of
Very
people that
wealthy,
do.
lucky people.
So it's just rolling.
Is that, did that apply to them?
What?
Are they very wealthy and lucky?
Yeah,
See,
They're not
Yeah,
lucky,
but they
no,
still have to
they
report
worked hard.
so lucky is the reason it's wrong?
No, they're just lucky.
They
They're
still
not
have to
lucky.
report it,
Yeah, let's see, this is City of Westminster.
because you guys still have to pay taxes.
Over 300,000.
No, they just wanna know where.
Yeah. Make sure it's not drug money.
Yes, especially in South
California.
Dakota.
There's rules for that too, you know.
Is what? There's rules for that too?
I don't know if you recall, but I talked about something called the FinCEN regulations. I touched on it very briefly.
I wrote down the initials, I can't remember what they stood for.
Federal government is watching over you. I don't know. Financial service, financial, I don't know. FINCIN, look, you have a computer in front of you. Anyway, you talk about, drug money things. If you're buying a residence in Dade, Broward, or Palm Beach County in an entity, like, in House Investment LLC, and it's over 300,000, and you pay cash, and by cash I mean you don't take a mortgage, there's a form.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about.
Yeah, there's a form.
What if it's under 300,000?
Under 300,000, it's exempt.
Huh?
It's exempt.
Then it
there's
could be drug money.
Right, correct. Small
It's
one.
okay for that little bit of drug money,
You have the source of funds if it's under 150,000,
You do not, for FinCEN, you don't have to bother, no, you don't have to report it under 300.
but for the IRS.
300 is a magical number because like in FIRPTA, the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act, if you are a foreign seller and the buyer is going to use it for a residence and it's under 300, there's no FIRPTA withholding. So,
We still gotta report to the IRS, correct?
no.
So-
Well, I mean, for regular sale purposes,
Yeah.
but not, you don't have to withhold.
You have to
So,
pay
did I
taxes
go over
on
FIRPTA at
it.
all?
Yeah, you just brushed
Well,
on.
because, yeah, it's a technical thing. So if a non-US taxpayer is selling a piece of real estate, you have, and they don't have a US taxpayer identification number and such, you have to withhold 10% under $1 million or 15% if it's over $1 million of their proceeds and send it to the IRS. It's a withholding. It's not a tax, which means they can then file a tax return.
They
If they
get
owe
some of
less
it back.
money, they might get back. Now, I just had one. This is unbelievable. I just had one where the seller had a loss. And so what we did was we held the money in escrow while we applied for a withholding certificate. That's where you can apply to the IRS and prove to the IRS that the amount of tax that you owe is less than the withholding amount. And therefore, they will give you a letter back and say, okay, so either send us this or you don't owe us anything.
So zero capital gains, basically, or negative.
They actually sold the property for less than they paid for it. It was
Okay.
no question about the fact that it was a loss. The closing took place in June of last year. We filed all the forms within a month after closing. On Friday, as in yesterday,
This
I got a
Friday?
fax from the IRS.
What?
It's supposed to be less than 60 days.
Well, they could be
Now-
making money off of that money. And
I will tell you, I got a,
The government was shut
I
down.
called them, no, I called them
That was
in,
only 6 months since June last year.
I called them on
They
the
try to
phone
support a wall.
3-4 months ago. Now, when I say I called them on the phone, my paralegal was on hold for an hour
Oh my
until they
god.
finally, they came on, so now they would only speak to me because I had filed a power of attorney. It's a tax form. They couldn't find the power of attorney. So I stayed on hold with the person for 10 minutes while she looked through, while then I had to scan and refax to her the power of attorney.
Oh my
Okay.
god.
she got the power of attorney, she entered all the information, she verified the power of attorney. I'm now on the phone for an hour and a half.
This is not shocking though.
This is not a
You
joke.
call the IRS.
Wait, it gets better, it gets
Wow.
better.
Oh,
She
please
says,
tell
okay,
me.
we have verified your authority, we appreciate you. Please hold while I transfer you while I transfer you to the department that handles the FERC withholding so you can work this out. Please hold. Click.
Look, I call them to pay the money.
What did you do? I would
What did I do? I said, send another letter.
I would probably break the phone in the
Okay.
wall.
So question, let's say if I got in unreported, it didn't happen, if I got unreported cash, and I bought a property cash, $298,000, right?
You talking about green cash?
Yeah,
What?
it's not imported.
Green cash, you have to, I'm talking about green cash as opposed to
US
not,
money.
as opposed to not finance. So you're not writing a check,
Correct,
right?
yes.
Over 10, you gotta report it.
Over time you have to. Oh.
I just had a situation pop up where somebody got
Purchase the
stuck.
house.
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Anytime you're gonna hand somebody $10,000 or more, or deposit in the bank, you have to fill out a tax form.
Are you gonna
Anything.
Not
be giving them
depositing in a bank. Just so-
What are you
just so
doing with
show
it?
them
like a
close
wire?
it.
You're gonna wire the money?
No,
You
it's
have,
a wire.
you have to somehow tell them where you got
It's
it.
happened. I
Oh,
had
you
I
show
had a
with
partner-
cash.
Just want to know
Yeah.
your
Let's
business.
say somebody shows you
'Cause they
cash,
want their cut.
$298,000 in cash on the table.
Somebody's gotta fill out a form.
Okay,
Yep.
so,
I mean, this was years ago, I had a gardener show up, literally with 2 crumpled brown paper bags.
Oh my
No,
God.
About 15,000, but still, it's a
Well, then
pain.
what's the 300 thing?
The worst,
Yeah, what's
that's different, that doesn't have to be cash, that can be just transfer money, checks, anything. That is and it's targeted, it's a targeted reporting order for Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County, I think it's also Manhattan, parts of Los Angeles, where if you're buying a residence, it's limited to a residence, in an entity for more than $300,000, you gotta fill out a form.
and less than?
What?
Less than?
No form.
So if I had, okay,
What-
so
what-
back to my
You're
question.
290.
If I formed the LLC and I came with 298,000
You're under the
cash,
limit.
I have to report it?
Nope.
No.
Where are you gonna, I mean, but if you're,
Just hypothetical.
well, so it's like any other, it's like any other,
Curiosity.
You sure?
any other illegal
You're gonna
activity.
be asking for a friend.
If you maneuver yourself the right way, then it works, there's ways around it. It's like the guy, there was a local merchant who had businesses all over the country who wound up in prison because they had literally sent a box of cash from New York to Miami, UPS,
Oh
and
my
the
God.
box popped open.
Oh.
The
Oh.
box actually, and the money went, so he got caught. Come on, if
Dumb.
you're doing that, you use what's called a mule, which is a person with a briefcase. I mean, it's in the movies. It's what you do. All right.
Duh, you just paid the
There's
same
ways
thing.
around
I'm paying
everything.
you $5K.
And-
Bring me my bag. You don't know what's in
Unfortunately,
there?
the more you know about this kind of stuff, the more ways there are to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard, I had one guy, and I don't remember the scheme that he had, but this was somebody I knew many years ago, he's not around anymore, and he explained to me a way where he could sell a piece of property to a shill, meaning a person who was helping him, who was like, didn't care about credit and taxes and things like that. So you're willing to buy your $290,000 house, I'm going to use you for an example. So,
Your friend. Tell him your friend.
so what I do is I have this house that I bought for $100,000, and I sell it to you for $250,000, and I take back from you a mortgage for $125,000. Okay? And you're working with me. So what I do is on a monthly basis, I hand you the paper bag of cash, which you deposit or do whatever you want because it's going to be under the various limits, and you make a mortgage payment to me.
Okay.
And so over time, what happens? The money gets cleaned. The cash gets slowly put back into the system. When it gets cleaned,
That's interesting.
it's, you gotta have somebody that doesn't care about reporting the deposits that's going to the bank.
Yeah.
I'm gonna recognize some income on but the money's getting cleaned, so the tax dollars doesn't matter. You just compensate everybody so the tax dollars are covered. Now let's go back to the real world and what happens when bad people don't, or when good people, people don't make their payments. Because I've been touching on the topic of foreclosure. Some years ago,
2008,
I
2006.
created the sarcastic Christmas time poem. We're past the season, all was ho ho ho's, let's foreclose. Better for Christmas than getting closed. Better not cry, you better not shout, because here comes the sheriff to throw you out. Yes, true, cruel. But you know, when you do a lot of it, what happened to me was, I wasn't foreclosed. In the last recession time, in the late 80s and early 90s, when real estate got very bad, because I've always been a practicing real estate lawyer, real estate got bad, and I was helping out doing one of the processes that I'm going to tell you about in the mortgage foreclosure group, and the firm came to me and they said, you see, you're doing this, you're helping us out, you're very efficient, you can handle things certain, would you like to take on the mortgage foreclosures? And I said, sure, where's the courthouse? Because I didn't know anything about litigation. I learned. And so when the real estate market was really in the tank, and I would not have been able to make any money doing closings, there I was doing mortgage foreclosures. Well, what's a mortgage foreclosure? A mortgage foreclosure is a judicial process by which the holder of the mortgage exercises its rights under the mortgage and takes back the property. It's not so easy as saying, give me the keys, because while I talked briefly about a deed in lieu of foreclosure, and that does work legally, what a mortgage foreclosure process really is, in a nutshell, is a title transaction. It is an involuntary title transaction. So you need to make sure, as the bank, that what you get back is clean title, because the only way the bank's going to get their money back is by selling the property and getting the money back. Because that's the whole purpose of the foreclosure process. So it begins after, forget the financial side of the bank side process after the default notice. When it gets into the hands of the attorney, the first thing that has to be done legally is a title search. Just like we do a title search for a closing to find out who has an interest in the property, you have to do a title search at the beginning of the mortgage foreclosure to see who may have an inferior interest, a subordinate interest in the property. Who could have a subordinate interest? Well, assuming, yes, question?
No, I thought you were asking a question.
So, we were talking about first mortgages and second mortgages. Well, obviously, we're going to assume for purposes of this conversation that the bank holds a first mortgage on the property. That's the normal situation for financing. So you do your title search and you see, are there any second mortgages? Well, it's pretty clear that a second mortgage would be inferior to the first mortgage. You want to see if there are any judgment liens. If a judgment is entered against a person, and the judgment is properly recorded in the public records, the judgment becomes a lien on the property. Sidebar, what's a judgment? If somebody owes you money and you sue them, the court says to this person owes you the money, pay them, they sign it, that's a judgment. You've gotten a judgment in a litigation action to be paid money. If that judgment is properly recorded, and this is beyond the technicality you need to know, but you have to record a certified copy of the judgment in the public records for it to become a lien on real estate.
A certified copy?
Certified copy must be recorded in the public records for it to become a valid lien on the real estate. So, yes?
And that lien transfers to multiple properties throughout the county?
Anything in the judgment debtor's name in that county.
In that county?
In that county.
Okay.
Public records are by county. There is also a state judgment registry, and that can attach to different property, but for real property it has to be in the county. So you do your title search. Anybody give me an example of what you cannot foreclose out as to the property?
Tax liens?
Right, real estate tax liens, real estate tax liens. And I'm saying that because I'm distinguishing real estate tax liens from a tax lien for not having paid your sales tax to the state of Florida, or not having paid your income tax or your withholding tax, or whatever other tax you might owe, where a tax lien gets filed. Those can be foreclosed out. So, when I said I was doing helping out in the foreclosure department, what I was really doing was examining title. I would get the title search and then I would hand the the information of the litigation person who was filing the mortgage foreclosure, telling them who needed to be made a party to the lawsuit. How do you start any litigation? You file what's called a complaint. A complaint is the first pleading, and the complaint goes through and names all the different things. It starts off by saying why we're in this court, who the parties are. Then it goes on to describe why we're here. I hold a mortgage, I hold a note, he didn't pay me, he owes me this, I want, I'm court foreclosed. At the same time, we would list XYZ holds a second mortgage. The mortgage is inferior to my mortgage that I'm foreclosing. Smith and Company owns a judgment lien. Judgment lien is inferior and it should be foreclosed. And you list all these things in the complaint. The complaint gets filed with the court. The complaint gets served on the defendants, not only the one that owes the money, but each of these subordinate lien holders. How do you serve it? A couple of different ways. Personal service. Personal service in any litigation is very simple. Basically, you're going to have a process server, often a sheriff, and sometimes a private party, actually come and hand you a piece of paper, virtually touch you and say, here is your summons. By handing you the piece of paper, you are personally served. In order to get a money judgment from someone, you must be personally served. You must have personal service to get a money judgment. The other kind of service is constructive service. Constructive service can only be used for what's called an in rem proceeding. That's where we're trying to take the property away from you. We're trying to foreclose the lien on the property, but we don't necessarily need a money judgment from you. Well, at the end of the process, I'm going to tell you why the money judgment and the personal service might be important as to the borrower. Remember the words deficiency. So constructive service can be by publication. In certain instances, like in a tenant eviction, it can be done by posting, where literally you take a copy of the complaint and all and stick it to the door. After you've tried to serve the person, you can post it by just sticking it to the door. Sometimes you can serve someone by serving a third party. In the case of a corporation, they have registered agents. Every corporation must maintain a registered agent and an office. Sometimes it's their office, sometimes it's a third party. Often it's the law firm, there's companies that act as registered agents, but it's some place that you designate within the state of Florida where you can serve that corporation. If you can publish notice in the newspaper in certain situations and obtain constructive service for the purpose of foreclosing a lien. At the end of the process, though, if you foreclose and you find out that the property is worth $3.2 million, and you remember the example of the deed in lieu of the short sale, the property is worth only $3.2 million and $4 million was owed, you then go back to the court and prove that up with an appraisal, and the court, if you have personal service, the court enters a deficiency judgment, which is a money judgment against the borrower, the person that signed his name to the I promise to pay or guarantee, saying, I owe the money. Deficiency judgment is for the difference between what you get for the value of the property at the time of the foreclosure sale and the debt. So the complaint starts it. The next pleading is a summons. The summons is actually issued by the court and given to the process server and says, we direct you to deliver this complaint to Mr. Smith, the defendant, and any of the other defendants. The summons gets served, and then a return of service gets filed back in the court file, which is part of the record that says that on such and such a date, the process server served Smith, handed it to him, handed it to his wife, handed it to somebody over the age of, I think it's 15, living in the house. There's rules. I don't remember what the exact age is, so. What happens after the complaint is served? Then the defendants have the opportunity to file an answer. The answer could say, yes, I agree, I give up. Very, very rarely. The answer could say, I deny this, 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 and this, meaning I'm saying that the things that are in the complaint are not true. If that's all it says, then the burden is on the plaintiff, as it would normally be, to prove those things to be true. That's close to general denial. It's just no, 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 because they're moving the case to the next step. And then there's something called an affirmative defense. An affirmative defense, and there is something specific that says, for example, this may be true what he says, but I paid him already, and here's my proof. Or I have a letter from him that says I don't have to pay for 6 months. Or he did this so that I wouldn't have to pay. So there's all kinds of affirmative defenses that can be filed, all as part of the answer. Once this complaint is served, you have 20 days to file an answer. If you don't file any kind of a response within that 20 days, the plaintiff can move for a default. And that is a pleading entered by the clerk that says 20 days has passed and nothing has been filed in answer to the complaint. If a default is entered against all the defendants, it's an automatic win. You go and you get your judgment entered and you move to the foreclosure. More likely, after an answer is filed, there's going to be motions to delay things. There's all kinds of, I'm not going to go into all the sidebars of litigation. I'm really just talking about the foreclosure. But there's things you can move for additional time. You can move for appointment of a receiver, for example. The plaintiff could move in a commercial situation if the case is going to take time. They can file a motion. And motions are pleadings that are filed in the court, and then a hearing would be set, and they'd argue back and forth. Once you get past that, the final motion that would be filed when you're done would be a motion, usually either a motion for summary judgment, and a motion for summary judgment says, if all the facts are true as we've alleged them in the complaint, then as a matter of law, we are entitled to a judgment. And judge, we say to you, based upon everything that's been filed, there's no argument over the facts. Therefore, you should give us the judgment. And unless the defendant can come forward and raise a question of material fact, the court's going to enter the judgment. What is a judgment? Judgment is the last pleading if the case comes to an, oh, by the way, the alternative to that is could be a trial, but whatever. Usually doesn't happen in foreclosure unless there's a lot of complicated defenses, but I don't want to get into, we're not doing litigation here. The judgment is the final document where the court reaches the conclusion, and in a mortgage foreclosure it's a pretty standard form, and it recites the complaint was filed, it recites a note of mortgage have been executed, it recites that there was a default, it recites how much money is owed, it recites that each of these subordinate lien holders has a position inferior to the mortgage, and then it says the plaintiff is entitled to $3,700,000 because of all the back interest and the money they pay for taxes and the attorney's fees and all that, and if this money is not paid by a date which is 45 days from today, or 30 days, or whatever the court gives, then the property will be, you've all heard the expression, will be sold on the courthouse steps.
Yeah.
There's a problem in Broward County. Courthouse doesn't have steps. It's true. It did once upon a time, one of the older buildings did, but it really, literally doesn't have steps. So that's a problem. Anyway, I think they used to do it in the lobby, right behind the escalator, but I think it's grown to where now it's actually it's online now. There's a site called Real Foreclose. You can go on any week and see foreclosure sales taking place.
What's it called?
Real Foreclose. I believe that's the name of it. So the courthouse steps has been replaced by your friendly computer. The problem with that is you got people that log on and bid, and they bid little amounts. And I'll tell you why that's a problem. Well, no, but I'm going to tell you why it's a problem for the banks. So after the judgment, you get to the foreclosure sale. So the bank, the holder of the judgment, we're using the bank as the example, the holder of the judgment is owed, in my example, $3.7 million. So they can bid $3.7 million for the property, and they don't have to pay anything because that's what they're owed. That's called a credit bid. They're entitled to the money, they get credit for what they're entitled to, and that's a credit bid. So if you want to buy the property, you would have to bid $3.75 or $3.7 million and a dollar in order to outbid the bank, unless the bank said they wanted more. Now the bank is very happy to take a dollar more because they're going to get all the money they're owed, and you're going to get the property and they don't have to have the property and be worried about it. The problem with the bidding at those numbers is documentary stamp tax. Remember I told you about stamp tax on a deed? At the end of the process, after the sale is done, a clerk's deed, a clerk's certificate of title is issued, which is the equivalent of a deed, but it comes from the clerk of the court, and that's subject to dock stamps and the amount of the debt. That's a lot of money. So what happens is the banks go and they start the foreclosure bidding at $100, because it doesn't matter what they bid. If no one bids against them and they bid $100, then the dock stamps cost them 70 cents. If they have to bid the 3.7 million, it's going to cost them thousands and thousands of dollars, and I'm not doing the math, but it's a lot of money. So usually what the instruction from the bank to the lawyers and the people doing the bidding are, they say, okay, bid the $100, and if somebody starts bidding against us, just go to the amount of the judgment, because you don't want to be spending all day there. So now what happens is, our friendly neighborhood bidder comes along, they're trying to buy something at the foreclosure sale cheap, and they bid $20,000. Okay, now no one's going to let the property go for $20,000 when they're owed $3.7 million, but all of a sudden the bank sees competitive bidding, and the instruction that's been given to them is bid the full judgment amount. So because this person takes advantage of the convenience of online bidding, they're costing the bank a fortune. It's good for the state because they're getting money. So
Sounds like a system problem.
it's not. You can't fix it because you know, anybody can bid whatever they want. The bank doesn't have to go to the full amount of their debt. They have the right to. In the example that we were talking about earlier, the mortgage amount may be $4 million. Remember I said, when I talked about the short sale, I said you have a $4 million mortgage, but the property's only worth 3.2. I moved it up to 3.7 with all the costs. So if they're owed $4 million, they can actually go all the way up and get the judgment for the $4 million plus the costs. So let's say it's $4.3 million, but the bank can give instructions to the lawyer and say, if anybody bids 3.2 or higher, stop. So there are circumstances where that $20,000 bidder will cause the bank to go not to the full amount of the judgment, but to some predetermined number. I do think there is a provision in the real foreclosed system, I don't think it's used very often, where the bank has the option to post how much they're willing to take. And the purpose of that is, again, they don't want the property back. If they take the property back, they've got to fix it up, and they have to resell it. They don't want to be bothered. So they go through, they can take less. They're always able to take less. Okay, questions? I happened to be looking through the book while you guys were taking the exam, and there's a case, of course, I don't know where the book came from originally, but no, I mean geographically.
Oh, okay.
But anytime you want to find a wacky example of anything that goes wrong in the system, where do we look?
Case one.
Florida.
Oh, I was going to say case one.
I mean, we are just the epicenter for things going wrong, whether it's screwing up an election or crazy people out there. So I want to tell you a little bit about this case just because it's interesting. And it's about bidding irregularity. So the basic rule of thumb is that a foreclosure sale would not be set aside unless there was a gross irregularity, something was really wrong with the procedure, or something really went bad with the sale. In this particular case, the lender foreclosed a mortgage on Florida property in the amount of $716,000. At the foreclosure sale, no one appeared on behalf of the bank. So your Joe Bidder showed up and bid $1,000. The property was actually worth $500,000. So Joe Bidder got it for $1,000. Well, the bank went, wait a minute, we made a mistake. We miscalendared, it wasn't communicated, the guy that was supposed to do the bidding didn't show up, his dog had the flu, whatever it was, they didn't get there. And the trial court looked at them and said, well, you know,
Sorry.
there was no gross inadequacy, you just screwed up. And the appellate court looked at it and said, wait a minute, this is clearly due to, they had magic words like mistake, accident, surprise, fraud, misconduct, or irregularity on the part of either the purchaser or any other person in connection with the sale, and the appellate court set it aside, and, which is the right thing to do in that circumstances. However, if there was a miscommunication and instead of going to 500,000, the bank person had stopped at 350, that's not grossly inadequate, and that would have been able to go through. But where it's really a screw up and it's really a problem, it can be set aside.
So the numbers has to be a little close by?
They don't have to be close by, but in terms of what we're talking about is the grounds necessary to set aside a foreclosure sale. Gross inadequacy would be a demonstration that something really was done wrong. This
For some reason, we all the way today.
receivers.
Good.
Now, for those of you who are always looking for ways to make money, the mortgage foreclosure business is not a terrible thing.
No.
I mean, you can get out there and make a living buying foreclosed properties. If you are willing to invest the money and make the loans, because there are people that have sufficient capital that they will make loans to third parties. They will take the risks dealing with the mortgage foreclosure process, because they know if they take the property back and there's some equity in the property, they can make a profit. It's done all the time. You have to be willing to get out there and be a property manager and make sure that you're collecting your payments. You have to make sure that you're willing to take care of the property if you get it back and it's in bad shape. You have to be able to evaluate your borrowers. You have to be able to evaluate the equity in the properties. There's all things you can do, but it's a business. But it's not something that should be done on the amateur level, because you'll get murdered. It's what happens, because people that think they can do it better than the banks typically can't. Because the banks have, now, what people can do better than the banks is make quick and intelligent decisions. Because unfortunately what happens anytime you're dealing with an institution, the people at the on the ground level don't have the ability to look at something and say, hey, wait a minute, if we take this short sale, we won't have to deal with the property, and yeah, we'll take a little bit less than we're owed, but we're done with it. They may take a look at the borrower. They may not take a careful enough look at the borrower to see that they're really not going to get any more money out of the borrower. And someone who's in the private business knows, I don't want to be bothered chasing them. When we take the property back, I'll resell it, I'll make my money back on the resale. Also, if you're originating privately held mortgages, and you do it the right way with the right equity, and typically what you're going to do is you can sell the property for a little bit more than you normally get for a cash or third-party financed investment, because people don't have to go out and get the third-party money and pay for it. So the equity, that you may take a little more equity, but you're getting a little more out of it. So let's take the house that would go for $250,000 by taking purchase money financing back as a seller in the business. It's careful, maybe you'll sell it for $300 because you can get more money because the people are just going to sign their name. And so you know that you've got that leeway there. And you can turn around and sell the mortgage to someone who's an investor for that kind of thing and take a discount on it, get your money out of it. Some abuses. There are opportunities for abuse in the foreclosure world, and it's not so prevalent today as it is in a downtime, but there are situations where there were lawyers that were working with the people that were occupying the property and working with the people that owed the money, and they would make deals with them. And they would do things like, okay, rent the property out for $500 a month, don't make your mortgage payments, I will stall the foreclosure, I'll file all kinds of paper and stall the foreclosure, give me half the rent. And then they would do things to stall the foreclosure, like before it got filed, they would file deeds to 10 people. Some of them were minors, some of them were in other states, some of them were even in other countries, which meant that the party doing the foreclosure would have to go nuts trying to serve everybody, which you have to do. All of this takes time. Each month they're collecting rent. Sometimes they would do something with the owner of the property who was having a struggle called cash for keys. This was a real thing, where they would go and they'd say, look, you're struggling, I see your mortgage is behind, I'll give you $1,000, give me your keys and leave. Then they would put a tenant in there and go through this process and let the mortgage foreclose, delay the foreclosure, and while this was going on, they were collecting the rent money.
Yeah.
When I moved here in 2010, I moved to this apartment building, and I was in there 4 days, and I got a foreclosure notice that I had to sign, even though I was a tenant. I had to receive it.
Yes, because like any other subordinate lien, your interest has to be removed from the property in order for them to take it back and resell it.
Okay. Well, I talked to the owner. He's still receiving my rent payments.
Of course.
He's not paying any rent to the bank. He bought the place. It was like $400,000, and it was valued at $100,000 at that point.
Right.
Wow.
It was
Well, that was the bursting of the bubble.
Biscayne, that's right. Biscayne Landing is the name of the place at the time.
Oh, okay.
It's in North Miami Beach.
125th of Biscayne Boulevard.
Yeah, exactly. And it was in a lot of I saw it in a lot of magazines and newspapers and stuff
Okay.
about something they worked with the city, and they built this place where we did this Olympic training facility, and it ended up with just 2 buildings.
Yep.
Beautiful apartments, large apartments, but so the reason I'm saying what is that once it went into foreclosure, and I'm still paying, and there were a lot of people in that building who were there 2 years and never paid a mortgage payment, and they couldn't kick them out or didn't kick them out because the bank didn't want the place abandoned, because the whole building is just full of hundreds of apartments, and all these people living in these luxury apartments who weren't paying mortgages.
Wow.
And lived there for free for 2 years.
Well, there's another problem with that. It's an interesting scenario. So now we're talking about a residential condominium building. So now you have the situation where the mortgage is not being paid and the bank is not enforcing their rights. Well, guess what else is not being paid? The condominium association.
That's right. It was $1,000 a month.
The condominium association is now starving because people, they got to maintain the place. They got to maintain the common areas, and in a fancy building like that, there's amenities that need to be maintained.
Right.
They're starving. The only way they're ever going to get the cash flow to start back up is for the bank to foreclose and put somebody else in there. So the association started doing something that in the past they never did, even though they had the legal right. They started foreclosing the association liens. Now the bank is superior to the association. They came first. So once that lien is filed, but if the bank isn't doing anything, there were circumstances where the association was actually acquiring title to the property. And it became a madness.
So the associations maintain their right to actually rent out the units too until the actual foreclosure happens.
If they own it, yes, absolutely. They become the
So
owner.
we're doing that.
They become the owner subject to this first mortgage. And if the first mortgage is moving too slowly, then they will do that and they'll take it back over.
Yeah,
It's owned by the
they
city of
didn't
North
take
Miami
it.
too. It's like
Yeah,
a shared
it's
investment between the developer and the city of North Miami. That's one of the reasons it was such a,
They never
Built on
took
the
back
lot.
the property though, they just, in lieu of getting back their money that they were owed, they put, instead of the property being vacant, they rented out the property, and there was some bylaw that gave them a time period where they could do it that was supposed to be up for review again.
There's been all kinds of statutory revisions, there's rights, there've been statutes created to provide rights to the tenants. What happens if there's a foreclosure? If there's a bona fide lease, the bank has to recognize it, because the tenants are kind of like innocent victims in all of this.
Yeah, that's what tenants were scared to even rent out a unit that was owned by an association, because they weren't the full owner, they just.
I said they sold the place, that you couldn't kick the tenant out until the end of their lease unless the person who bought it was intending on moving in.
Correct.
They had like 3 months or something.
Correct. Okay, so I've reached the end of my stuff, and I see the zombie zone has arrived. You've survived the exam. I'm going to give you a break, unless anybody has any more questions. Go in peace. Next week we're going to talk about leases, which I will warn you is one of my favorite topics. So we're going to have some material to go through.
Yeah, it was great. First break today, it was great. Right next to it. It was supposed to rain.
So there's a again, I'm trying not to keep this so strictly project, but there's which is now called the service